Petra.
Thank you so much, and hello to everybody. It's a real delight to be able to deliver this presentation to you. And thanks for showing up. And I'm really, my commitment is that it's worth your while and that you get heaps of new perspectives out of it. So I'm going to share my screen. Right, and I put you down here. Oops. Right. Given that Anna already has done the acknowledgement, I think I just add to the acknowledgement. And before I start, let me start by introducing myself so that you have a little bit of the context for my presentation. So I grew up in East Germany, and that has given me lived experience of a different social system. But also I grew up with a holistic education, and that will be relevant for this presentation. Then I studied actually not only psychology, but also anthropology and sociology and horticulture. So I'm weaving all of those different disciplines together in whatever I'm doing. And it's really giving me a particular lens for which I'm viewing the world. I also traveled a lot. I lived in different countries. Originally, I'm from Germany, and I lived in New Zealand and Australia. So that's giving me a lot of lived experience of different cultures as well. And for 15 odd years, I have been engaged in the disaster space. This is really coming out of my concern for what's happening to nature, but also what's happening to us human beings. And also over the last probably 10 years, I have been involved in transformative education. And then since 2014, I have had the huge privilege and honor to interact and learn from Indigenous peoples in Australia, particularly up in the north of Australia, but also in Taiwan. And now since I'm here in Canberra, I'm connecting also with Indigenous peoples in Canberra, but also Indigenous peoples worldwide. So that's basically all of those things from my background I'm going to bring to this presentation and to my line of thinking. Now, what I would like to do in the next 50 minutes or so, to really take you a little bit on a discovery journey. Now, there's a little bit of a warning. It can be a little bit uncomfortable, but what I really invite you to do is to bring openness to this presentation, at least for the 50 minutes or so, to consider it, to try it on, what I'm sharing and offering. And if you don't like it at the end, I'm more than happy for you to give it up at the end and basically shelve it away. But for the next 50 minutes or so, please be open. As I said, it could be becoming a little bit rough. It might mean that some of the things I'm saying might be a little bit challenging for you. I invite you to consider that it's also important to unlearn what we have learned so that we can actually take on new perspectives. And then changing your perspectives is actually can change your experience, and that might actually enable us to have a more broader point of view, and like the eagle, having the big picture, but also seeing the details as well. So that's in store if you bear with me throughout the journey. So let's start. So the challenge really is for us, suffering and surviving is increasingly a challenge. We have a situation where we have increasingly mental and physical disease to cope with, violence and wars, climate change, environmental destruction, loss of biodiversity, but also extreme natural events, disasters, and now pandemics are challenging our normal ways of living as well. So we could take the bigger picture and could use all of that and actually step back from it and to say, what's going on? How did we end up in this situation, which is clearly not where we want to be? why have we been living in ways that created those detrimental impacts that are counter to what we actually want to achieve? Because I'm sure that none of us wants to be in this position. So why, how did we end up here? And also importantly, what could be done to turn the tide and to survive and thrive? So that's kind of the questions. Now, interestingly, John Dewey says we do not learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on experience, and the emphasis is on reflecting on. So just experiencing stuff is not important for us to actually learn. So why are we not learning and reflecting? Because otherwise we wouldn't be in this position if we would have done that. Why have we been ineffective correcting our course despite our situation getting worse? So I invite you to consider that we are too busy doing stuff, but also that large numbers of us are lacking the cognitive capacities. And this is really a result of being socialized and enculturated, or basically we could also say conditioned into a Western capitalist worldview and society. And this Western worldview has very specific beliefs about nature of our original reality and what can be known and what is valid knowledge. And I'm going to share a little bit more about that and how this particular worldview actually has been creating what we are experiencing now. And the challenge is that those worldviews are very habitual and unconscious. It's a little bit like the fish in the water, not realizing that the fish is in the water. So it's really difficult then to reflect on it. But those worldviews really influence what we see, and more importantly, also what we don't see. And that might be exactly the challenge we are having while we are not learning. And also it's very often difficult to imagine different ways for us. Now, this worldview is also constantly reinforced by the large cultural narratives and by the social systems we created. So it's kind of a self-sustaining vicious cycle, if you like, we are engaged in. And that also leads to us having challenges with uncertainty, and we are in very uncertain times. And what happens at the moment when we are in uncertain times is we determine what is correct by finding out what other people believe is correct. Social psychology says that's, it's called social proof. Now that's a major strength because it kind of helps us to shortcut, but it can also be a major weakness. And also, as already Walter Lippmann said many years ago, we all think alike, no one thinks very much. And all think alike, no one thinks very much because there is no innovation and creativity. And I found this picture and I thought, well, that is very pertinent to that, because that's actually happens when we're looking in uncertain times for what everybody else is doing. Now, I invite you to consider this is actually exactly what happened with toilet paper here in Australia. And I actually read a newspaper article which asked people who were buying toilet paper, why are you buying them? And they said, well, because everybody else is buying them. So we thought it's important to buy them. Now, you might laugh about that, but actually this is what's creating social movements and which is creating worldviews as well. And then in the end, nobody actually knows why we are going in this direction and whether that is actually a good and useful direction for us to go through. Now, also the challenge is that human beings turn out to be very resistant to change. In a sense, once we invested in a worldview, we have to believe in that worldview because we invested too much into it. We have given up too much and sacrificed too much to be part of it very often. Also, trying something new is risky because, hey, in the end, it could be worse. Who knows, right? And that it could be worse largely also stems from we don't know how to change, or how to change in ways to ensure that what we are creating is better, because we are largely lacking the required capabilities. And also, we are really afraid of making mistakes because our society created very much a blame culture, and it's very costly for us to make mistakes. So we could say, well, why are we having, created clearly something which is not working for us? And interestingly, it's useful to look at Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So according to, and this theory is very well supported by research over many years. So according to this theory, human beings just before, during childhood and up to adolescence, we engage in concrete operational thinking, and then we shift to formal operational thinking. But do we? So let's have a look what each of those kinds of thinking bring with us. So in the concrete operational thinking, we can only think concretely about factual ideas and experiences. Basically, we can only concentrate on facts. Reality is only what's observable. We believe that we see actually objectively what's there. We can't see and understand invisible aspects or concepts. We can't view the present as a piece in a process. So we are just basically living in the moment, but we can't make connections to the past or into the future. So we are restricted to the immediate present. And also we are using largely trial and error for problem solving, which is quite limited and takes a long time. Also, we have a very egocentric view. We only see the world from our own perspective. We are really it's difficult when you're in concrete operational thinking to see the world from somebody else's perspective. And we also fail to perceive the limitations of logic. We can't temper logic with imagining and considering other people's view. So we are very much basically fixed on logic. And also we are quite preoccupied with how others see us when we are in this particular stage of thinking. And we are unwilling to accept criticism and blame others. Now, I invite you to consider that this kind of thinking actually created the current situation. And it makes it, this kind of thinking makes it very difficult to respond and adapt to a complex and rapidly changing world. Now, hypothetical thinking is different, and the formal operational thinking is different because actually, by then, which is typically occurring during adolescence, our brain develops cognitively the capacity for hypothetical thinking. Now we can see and understand the self and the world as a process. We can integrate past, present, and future, which means we can actually see how the past created where we are now, and we can also imagine the future, and we can also see the consequences, the possible consequences of our actions, which wasn't possible and available for us before. We can also see and understand intangible aspects, so like spiritual aspects, and hypothetical concepts. So we can logically now think about hypothetical scenarios and intangible processes. We also can understand probabilities and correlations. Now, understanding probabilities is particularly important for identifying the risk for particular things to occur. Wasn't available to us before. We can importantly take others' perspective, and we can actually view issues from multiple perspectives and see relationships between them. And we can engage in inductive and deductive reasoning. So before we could only engage in deductive reasoning. So we could only go from general principles to specific instances. But now in the formal operational thinking, it's available for us to actually also engage in induction, which gives us the half of the very important learning spiral. So we can learn from our own observations and create tentative hypotheses and theories and generalizations and then test them. Now that wasn't available for us before. So in this then, this type of thinking gives us critical understanding of information. We are receptive to new and contradictory ideas. we can understand symbolism, and we can also make inferences to social implications and moral critique. And also importantly, we can apply learnings to diverse and novel problems, which happens when we are in uncertain times. And very important, only in this stage of thinking, we can start reflecting, and we can think about thinking, which implies the potential for managing our thinking. We can actually start mastering our own mind. Now, some adults also reach post-formal thought. And if you look through all of those things in post-formal thought, that is exactly the kind of capabilities we would like to have or develop in people so that they can actually respond to, prepare, respond to, and rebuild effectively after disasters. But note, only a couple of adults actually get to this post-formal thought. We would be fine if most of us would have the formal operational thinking available to them, but only 40 to 60% of people actually attain formal operational reasoning. So basically, we have not all of us, even though we are saying adolescents are accomplishing this stage. Most of actually a large number of people actually never attain this formal operational reasoning, which is required for us to respond to uncertainty, disasters, and challenging situations. It's even worse, formal operational thinking is becoming less common among high school students. So actually there's a dramatic decrease in people reaching this, this operational thinking. So really, really challenging then for us to, as human beings in the Western world, to deal with the situation. The good news is actually our brains are capable of engaging in those formal operational and post-operational thinking, and whether we reach the potential of our brains to reach those stages of thinking really is influenced by our cultural and societal values and practices. And that's the good news, because we can influence them. So how can we turn the tide then and live individually and collectively in ways that have us or our environment on which we depend not only survive, but thrive and accomplish what we want? Einstein said we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created. So that gives us a clue that the source is our way of thinking, which gets us in trouble. And then hence, if we shift our way of thinking, then we can turn the tide. So that starts with shifting our worldview. So we have to leave charted waters and really get into changing our perspective. Now, the good news is also that disasters and now particularly also the pandemic, which is worldwide, is kind of forcing us into shifting our perspective, because our old ways of thinking clearly are not functional anymore. And if we're changing the way we are looking at things, the things we look at change. So you might ask, what's a worldview? Well, our worldview is our fundamental beliefs about the nature of our origin and the development of the universe, or what's called cosmology within philosophy, the nature of our existence and world and what exists and is real, or ontology, and the nature of knowledge and what we can know and constitutes valid knowledge. So our beliefs about the nature or origin of the universe determine then also what we believe exists or what doesn't exist, what's real. Do we believe it's only real what we can see? Or are we believing that it's also real, or the intangible things, the invisible things are also real? Now, depending on how we answer this question, we will answer the next question, what we can know, what kind of knowledge we can know, and also what constitutes valid knowledge. So all of those three together, the answers to those three questions, guide us how to ideally interact and coexist with other human beings and the natural world. And that's actually what's within the philosophical paradigm, which is behind ethics, or the ethical component. It also influences how we organize and govern society. And the questions also, the answers to those questions also determine how to ideally relate and appreciate our environment, to experience and to live a meaningful life. And that's aesthetics. So I invite you that there is broadly, and that's a very, just for the purposes really of this presentation, for you to see the difference in how those worldviews and those components of the worldviews influence what we have in our lives. I like to invite you into a journey of the Western perspective and looking whether there might be another alternative perspective. You could also say that worldviews are like classes. You know, we throughout our whole life, we are learning a lot, and each of those learnings color actually how we see the world. Now, if you think about, if we put on glasses, and if you put, for example, rose-colored glasses on, what's likely to happen in the first couple of moments? You see basically the world as rose-colored, right? But what happens after a couple of minutes? Don't know whether it can. So what happens after a couple of minutes is that this is just the world, how it occurs to you. It becomes habitual and unconscious. You don't question whether that's reality or not. It is just what it is. And this is how ingrained worldviews are to human beings. And hence how this makes it also challenging for us to shift them. But it is possible, so that's the good news. So what is our predominant current ways of thinking in the Western world? And what's the impact on recovering and rebuilding? So I invite you to consider that in the Western world, we pretty much have a totalitarian, mechanistic, positivistic, objectivistic, and rational worldview. So from this perspective, there's only one single absolute and stable reality or truth. We believe basically that what we see is real. It is a one-to-one correspondence to what really is there. And that our behavior is governed by universal mechanistic laws. All of the quantitative research we are doing is designed to find answers and or to find those universal laws. And also from this perspective, laws can be deducted by analyzing parts rather than looking at the whole. So be a reductionistic approach. From this perspective then, so that's the ontology, so that's the belief about the nature of the world. So that means then, from this perspective, in terms of the valid knowledge, is only seen predominantly what can be observed, operationalized, and measured, objective facts. And knowledge production is largely quantitative research. Quantitative research is the hallmark of scientific inquiry from this perspective or worldview. And the outcome are universal abstract theories to predict and control behavior. Now, also from this perspective, humans and nature are separate. That's basically the whole Cartesian mind and body split. As a result, then, we very much believe in the Western system, only humans have intelligence. Nature can't teach us anything. And hence, we believe we are independent of nature and can exist without nature. And we are, developing a lot of technologies to allow us to live separate from nature. We are very much growing up disconnected from nature. We are really alienated and dishonor nature. You know, if you ask children now in big cities where food comes from, for example, they will tell you from the supermarket. This is how alienated we have become from nature. And hence, because we can't see the connections anymore from most people, particularly those ones living in big cities, we are not realizing that actually we are depending on nature, and hence we are not valuing nature. And also nature becomes a resource to be justifiably conquered, owned, controlled, and exploited. So from this perspective, then, it's not important to live in harmony with nature for our survival. And we are living in pretty much increasingly disconnected and disharmonious relationship with nature, self, and others. Now, it's exactly those disharmonious relationships which increasingly a large body of literature identifies leading to our emotional, psychological, political, social, and ecological crisis, which then leads to the occurrence also of extreme natural events and disasters. This is how basically our worldview in the Western world, our predominant worldview in the Western world, creates basically what we are experiencing. It also then, as I said before, increasingly us experiencing extreme natural events and disasters could really kind of waken us up. And result in us reflecting and reconsidering and looking what's going on and correcting the course. However, because this worldview is very much linked with operational thinking. So the lower stage of thinking, or the more limited, not lower, the more limited stage of thinking, we are currently not able to do that tremendously well. And so even now with the pandemic, we are kind of seemingly, even though there is lots of hope and lots of good stuff coming out, but largely it seems that we are still not able to actually harness the space disasters are creating or crises are creating for transformation and shifting worldviews. So there is the likelihood, if we are not really working on shifting the worldview, that the rebuilding will be more or less the same. And there's so many examples if you look particularly at the national level in many countries. It's going to be more or less the same, and we're going to make the same mistakes. It seems like there's even more controlling, exploiting, and managing and combating of nature happening. Silos and separations of the disaster risk reduction field from community development and from society at large seems to be not shifting and will still be happening. Utilizing quantitative sciences, engineering, and technology largely to create our the rebuilding or feed into the rebuilding, and just the recent proposal by the education minister is testimony that we are not learning, unfortunately. Yeah, in terms of education, then from this perspective, basically education is designed to reproduce and reinforce the dominant Western capitalist worldview. It's basically still experts telling people specialized in abstract knowledge at designated times to only consider the visible, observable aspects of reality. The education is largely disconnected from country and nature, and put in subjects and disciplines that separates knowledge. And really, and again, how the latest proposal about which courses to support and which ones not to support, very clearly shows the aim is producing workers, not citizens, but it is citizens which we need, or who we need, to turn the tide. So education from the Western perspective, or based on the Western worldview, is largely disempowering people. It's oppressing and weakening citizens to keep them manageable and to maintain the status quo. So then the question is this worldview the truth? Is it true that there's only one objective truth? Is it true that reality is a mirror of what we see? Because only if we say yes to the last two questions, we will continue buying into this worldview. So I have a question for you. What do you see? Black or black and blue, or white and gold? I'm going to very quickly stop sharing. So if you can just give me an indication with your, with your reactions. Who of you is seeing black and blue? White and gold, Jeremy? Okay, you can use the chat as well, or you can just give me an indication with the reaction button. And I see black and blue.
No, white and gold.
Oh, white and gold. Okay, white and gold. Andrew also white and gold. Bob white and gold. Steve white and gold. Okay, great, thanks. Who's and Zoe as well. Who's seeing black and blue?
So you use the reactions, the buttons around the reactions, if you want.
Yeah. Or the chat will do too. But I invite you to consider very often we have both. We have typically we have about half, well, mostly more white and gold, but we often also have people who can see blue and black. Now, if you're seeing white and gold, you might ask yourself, well, there is no way, of course, that is absolutely the truth that this dress is white and gold. Oh, from here. It's, that's, crystal clear. And I invite you to consider that those people who are seeing the black and blue, they will say, oh, hold on, it's crystal clear that it is black and blue. How on earth can you see white and gold? Now, actually, I invite you to consider that both of you are right. So if you, and I'll tell you why. So those people who fill in the background around the dress in certain types of colors and bluish colors, they are more inclined to see the the dress in white and gold. And those people who are filling in the background in more those yellowish, reddish colors, they are more inclined to see the black and blue. Now, how we color in the background depends on our past experiences. So our past experiences shape how we are seeing this dress and by extension, the world. Now, I hope that this is working. So there should be, yep. So we obviously, and I could, come back to you, but probably most of you haven't seen the moonwalking bear. Now, once you actually put your, because you've been focusing on counting the numbers of passes as instructed, right? And then when the video was rewinded, you suddenly saw the moonwalking bear. And I hope what happened in your mind was, oh my God, how could I miss it? That was my first reaction. How could I possibly miss this moonwalking bear? Easy, right? Because we didn't put our intention onto it. Now I invite you to consider that this is happening again and again a lot in your life. That you are seeing only what you're putting your intention onto, and you're not seeing other things. Which then begs the questions, how come we are focusing on one or on certain things and not putting our intention onto other things? And the next question could be, what else are we missing? What is it, what we are missing? Consider what we are missing, what we are focusing our intention on is basically, again, conditioned and determined by our worldview, which is constantly reinforced. And the things which we are not seeing is exactly the things which hinder us, because we are not seeing them. This is hindering us from turning the tide. And if we could see them, we would have totally different possibilities and options and opportunities available for turning the tide. So really important to recognize that, even what we are seeing is shaped by our past experience and attention. Now, Gregory, a very well-known British neuropsychologist, said, "What we see is what our brain sees, not what our eye sees." So according to him, what we see is based on more than 90% on our memory, and only less than 10% actually sensory nerve signals. So 90% in whatever, in every second of our lives, 90% of what we are seeing is actually filled in by our brains. So I hope that indicates that the totalitarian, mechanistic, positivistic, objectivistic, and rational worldview of in Western cultures, which is predominantly happening in Western cultures, is not the truth, but a truth. The question then becomes, are there alternative worldviews which might be more functional to us? And I invite you to consider that the indigenous worldview could be such an alternative worldview. The ontological and the epistemological assumptions of this worldview are metaphysical, nature-based, unified, and egalitarian. Now, those worldviews, indigenous worldviews, are very diverse. So I'm just basically giving you an essence on the examples of the Australian indigenous perspective, based on those literatures, but also my own experiences working with indigenous peoples and my own personal experiences as well. So from the indigenous worldview, female and male metaphysical beings created the land and all creatures by traveling across undifferentiated space. And by discovering, by observing, experiencing, and learning behaviors that created harmony, joy, health, and well-being, or those behaviors that interrupted harmony and created pain, chaos, and disease. And this created, those learnings created their worldview. And this worldview is a guide to interact with nature and each other in harmonious ways, because if this happens, then human beings experience harmony, joy, health, and well-being. So from the indigenous perspective, there is not only a physical world, which we ascribe to from the Western worldview, but also a spiritual worldview, which is metaphysical, invisible, subjective world, and is largely referred to as the dreaming. And the spiritual world actually creates the physical world, and the physical world then creates the spiritual world. So experiencing then the physical world provides an access to the invisible world and realizing those metaphysical powers. Also, from this perspective, all creatures common in origin, have a common origin, the same life force, and are basically, we are all one, equal, and connected and interrelated. Now you might start listening to that and think, okay, that might be the formal operational thinking here happening, and you would be right. So this worldview then makes people aware of the interdependencies with all creatures. And hence, as a result, indigenous peoples are looking after the land, and the land then looks after them. And they created over thousands of years very sophisticated nature of knowledge systems. Because they're recognizing and valuing the wisdom of nature, they believe nature is the greatest teacher and Earth is basically a library. And so, as I said, they created a highly complex ecological knowledge systems. They care for nature and feel responsible for keeping Earth in its original purity and potency. And actually, their life purpose is seen as recreating and passing on the physical world or nature to the next generations. So they created sophisticated and embodied knowledges of nature and humans, but also culture, social systems, governance, laws, and education all support that human beings are interacting with nature in harmonious relationships. So that ensures then that humans are living connected to and in harmony with nature. So we have both worldviews here. So the Western worldview is creating the left side, and the indigenous worldview is creating the right side. And as I said, question to you, can you see links to the operational and formal operational thinking? And as I said before, if you put the two together, the concrete operational thinking very much is connected to the Western perspective, whereas the formal operational thinking is connected to the right, the indigenous worldview. So our indigenous worldview is valid, while actually increasingly social constructionist paradigms in quantum physics are providing massive amounts of evidence that there is some validity, or not some, there is a lot of validity to indigenous worldviews. And I'll let you read that by yourself. It's the unity that everything is one, that we are all one, all creatures are one, and that there is an invisible connection between everything, is increasingly discovered by quantum physics. As Zimmerman said also, that we are all one, and that energy has a potential, and that according to thousands of repeated experiments, these waves of potential are highly influenced by the energy of human intention and thought. So the human intention and thought is directly shaping our lives and our planet. So that's basically the spiritual world shaping the physical world. And quantum physics has provided us with amazing evidence that human perception of reality coupled with vigilant observation changes reality. So again, what we see is actually creating our reality. Again, the whole connection between the spiritual and the physical world. Our indigenous worldview is functional, we could ask. Is it worthwhile us going there? Well, indigenous peoples have survived for at least 60,000 years. They are also still here despite colonization, and that is a miracle to me. And I call indigenous peoples really the masters of resilience, because to survive the colonization efforts, that shows tremendous strength. So their worldview works tremendously well. So how could we then shift towards indigenous worldviews? I invite you to consider that transformative learning could be a really important pathway. Transformative learning generates deep structural shifts in the basic premises of thoughts, feelings, and actions. So it's basically, it has the capacity to shift those unconscious habitual worldviews. And we all have experienced, typically at random, those aha moments or awakening experiences of epiphanies, and that is basically transformative learning, which makes us more expansive, discriminating, and integrative worldviews, new levels of awareness, authenticity, and responsibilities. And responsibility is a biggie we want to have in having people taking responsibility of what we have been creating and how we can create a different future. Also, people experience vitality, wonder, and openness. And it increases people's ability to change and act and to engage in effective social actions. Now, all of those elements are connected to formal operational thinking or post-formal operational thinking. So that's exactly the shift you want to see. And all of that shifts then how people relate to and with others and nature. Now, transformative learning can be stimulated by rational processes, by examining, reflecting, questioning, and revising our perceptions of ourselves and the world. And transformative education is tremendously well suitable to do that. Nature-based and critical pedagogies as well. And also indigenizing the curriculum in the West could make a massive difference. And I'm very, very proud to report that my university, the University of Canberra, is engaging in indigenizing the curriculum. So I'm really thrilled with that. Transformative learning can also be stimulated by extra-rational ways of knowing, which are beyond cognitive thoughts. So it's all the symbolic, imaginative, and emotional experiences we are having. Creativity and imagination and other processes outside of our conscious awareness. So those extra-rational ways of knowing can be induced and stimulated by people interacting with nature. And there's, again, an increasing body of literature attesting to the transformative powers of nature. Arts and humanities also very important in stimulating those extra-rational ways of knowing. And indigenous knowledges and sensitivities are operating at those extra-rational ways of knowing. So if we would engage in those pathways, we could really transform those Western worldviews, which have brought us to the undesirable situation we are experiencing now, and to the brink of extinction, really, or an existential crisis. Now there's other transformative pathways, and that is really relearning from indigenous peoples, and to really work together with indigenous peoples to experience. And we are in this tremendously fortunate situation in Australia that we have the oldest indigenous peoples in the world, and who are still very, very connected up in remote communities, in particular to the traditional ways, to the traditional worldviews and the indigenous ways of seeing the world and knowing and doing. Critical, qualitative, and indigenous research is another transformative pathway where we can do the induction from the bottom up and generate knowledges together with people, not doing research to people, but actually doing research with people and supporting them in them actually building the capacities and shifting from the operational to the formal thinking. Two-way, transdisciplinary, and multi-sector dialogues. If you can engage them, then together we will come up with amazing solutions and new solutions. To be able to do that, that will require transformation. And also reconnecting science, arts, and spirituality, which we have been in the Western system disconnecting. But if we can connect them back, that would open up a lot of different transformative pathways. And for us, actually, also from the science side, to communicate with people in ways which people actually understand using arts, because that's what arts is designed to do. And in terms of governance systems and processes, sociocracy is one of the really promising governance systems which I have found a couple of years ago, which really give power over back to people, and create a larger governance system and social system which actually is empowering people rather than oppressing people. So that if we can engage more in sociocracy, that would make a massive difference. So weaving it all together, the current situation we are finding ourselves in could be connected to a large in the West, in our Western worldview, and this Western worldview being very much connected to concrete operational thinking, whereas the potential for rebuilding in ways which actually has us thriving, not only surviving, but actually thriving in all different areas of life, which is connected to our wellness, is largely dependent on an indigenous worldview, which is in line with formal operational thinking and post-formal operational thinking. And we could use transformative education and those different rational and non-supernatural pathways of transformative education. So the choice is ours. The question is, will we engage in this journey, which could be a really massive journey for us to take, which would see us creating rebuilding better, and that's exactly what you want to do. So I leave you with this thought that the earth is our mother. Whatever befores the earth befores the sons and daughters of the earth. This we know. All things are connected. Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. So thanks for coming onto the journey with me. I hope you enjoyed this journey, and that you come out with a more enriched perspective. And and I'm looking forward to your comments, questions, feedback in general.